The brick came through the window at 9:47 p.m. Mrs. Evelyn Higgins didn't scream. She'd lived through the London Blitz as a child. A thrown brick was practically nostalgic. She set down her red pen, carefully marked her place in the crossword puzzle book, and walked to the shattered window with the deliberate pace of someone who refused to be rushed by hooligans. The brick lay on her Persian rug, wrapped in a greasy piece of paper. She picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were a student's particularly disappointing essay, and read the note. Last warning, old lady. Sell the property, or it burns. You got 1 week. D. Outside, she could hear the rumble of a truck engine fading into the distance, followed by cruel laughter that echoed off the mountain slopes. Mr. Darcy, her ancient tabby cat, hissed at the broken glass. I quite agree, Mrs. Higgins said, reaching for the phone. The line was dead. Cut again. Derek's favorite trick. She stood there in her modest nightgown, 4'11" of retired English teacher, looking at the cardboard she'd have to tape over the window. Again, this was the 3rd brick in 2 months. The sheriff's office was 40 minutes away on a good day, and Sheriff Morrison had made it clear he wasn't interested in disputes between neighbors. Mrs. Higgins had taught English literature for 43 years. She'd tamed classrooms full of hormonal teenagers. She'd survived budget cuts, incompetent administrators, and 3 different curriculum reforms that had nearly given her an aneurysm. But Derek Mullins, local meth cook, property grabber, and all-around waste of oxygen, was testing even her legendary patience. She taped the cardboard over the window, made herself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and sat back down with her crossword. The clue was justice delayed. 7 letters. She wrote, revenge. What Mrs. Higgins didn't know was that 70 miles north, 16 motorcycles were racing against the worst blizzard to hit the Rockies in 30 years. And in approximately 4 hours, her quiet Victorian cottage would become very, very loud. The snow started as a whisper. Butcher noticed it first, tiny flakes appearing in his headlight beam like static on an old television. He'd been riding for 27 years, and he knew mountain weather. This wasn't good. Boss, Tiny's voice crackled through the helmet comm. Weather report says we got maybe an hour before this gets bad. Butcher glanced at his GPS. They were still 40 miles from the clubhouse, and the mountain pass was the only route that wouldn't add 3 hours to their trip. He'd made this calculation 100 times. Usually, it worked out. Usually, he wasn't carrying 15 tired bikers who'd just spent 3 days at a funeral for one of their own. We pushed through. Butcher's voice was gravel and authority. Stay tight. Watch your spacing. Behind him, the Iron Vanguard's MC rolled in formation. 15 bikes, 15 brothers, all wearing their cuts with the Iron Vanguard emblem on the back. They were coming home from burying Old Jack, their former sergeant-at-arms, who'd finally lost his 20-year battle with lung cancer. The snow got heavier. Within 20 minutes, the whisper became a scream. Wind howled through the mountain pass like a living thing, hurling snow horizontally across the road. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. Butcher's hands were going numb even through his gloves. Boss, I can't see the road. That was Scribbles, the youngest prospect, barely 23 and still learning not to panic. Follow my tail light. Butcher yelled back. Don't stop, don't. His front tire hit a patch of black ice. The bike went sideways. Butcher's combat instincts kicked in. He'd been in firefights in Fallujah that were less terrifying than this moment. He fought the slide, somehow kept the bike upright, somehow didn't go over the cliff that he knew was somewhere to his right. Behind him, he heard the sickening sound of metal on asphalt. Someone went down. Stop! Stop! Tiny's voice, panicked. Chains is down. Repeat, Chains is down. Butcher pulled over, his heart hammering. The temperature had dropped to something that felt like the surface of Mars. His beard was already crusted with ice. He stumbled back through the whiteout to where Chains lay beside his fallen bike, clutching his leg. It's not broken. Chains gasped through gritted teeth. Just twisted. I can ride. He couldn't ride. They all knew it. And in this storm, staying here meant dying here. Butcher looked around desperately. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, no cell service, no shelter. Just mountains, snow, and rapidly approaching death. That's when Tiny spotted it. Boss, light. There's a light. Through the swirling white hell, maybe 200 yards off the main road, a warm yellow glow pierced the darkness. A house. Someone's house. Can you walk? Butcher asked Chains. Can I breathe? Then I can walk. They abandoned the bikes, pulling them off the road as best they could. Tiny practically carried Chains. The others stumbled through knee-deep snow toward that impossible, beautiful light. Up close, the house was absurd. A Victorian cottage, all gingerbread trim and delicate architecture, completely out of place in these brutal mountains. Light glowed from every window. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Butcher didn't knock. Couldn't afford manners. He turned the doorknob, unlocked, thank God, and pushed the door open. Warmth hit him like a physical force. The living room was something from a period drama. Antique furniture, bookshelves covering every wall, a genuine Persian rug in deep reds and golds. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. And sitting in a high-back chair, with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle book, was the smallest woman Butcher had ever seen. She looked up at him over half-moon reading glasses. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Butcher was 6'4", 260 pounds of scarred muscle and badly contained violence. He was covered in ice, dripping melted snow onto her floor, and behind him, 15 more frozen outlaws were stumbling through the door. Mrs. Evelyn Higgins was 4'11" in her sensible slippers. She wore a cardigan that looked older than Butcher. Her white hair was pulled into a neat bun. She looked like someone's grandmother, if that grandmother had been forged from iron and educated at Oxford. She set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "You," she said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who'd spent decades teaching proper English. "Will remove those muddy boots." Immediately, Butcher blinked. His hand was still on his concealed pistol, reflex from a life where every door might hide an enemy. He was cold enough to see his own breath indoors. Chains was groaning behind him. Tiny looked ready to collapse. And this tiny woman was worried about boots. "Lady," Butcher started, his voice coming out as a growl. "We got injured men. We got." "I can see that you have injured men," Mrs. Higgins interrupted, standing up to her full, unimpressive height. "I can also see that you are tracking snow, ice, mud, and what appears to be motor oil across a genuine Persian rug that survived the Blitz, the Kennedy administration, and a particularly rowdy book club meeting in 1987. She pointed a wooden ruler. "Where had that come from?" "At a boot tray by the door." "Boots. Off. Now, then we will address your injuries, provide hot beverages, and discuss exactly how 16 grown men managed to get themselves trapped in a blizzard that has been forecasted for 3 days. The room went silent except for the crackling fire and Chains's labored breathing. Tiny whispered, "Boss, she's got a ruler." Butcher looked at the ruler, then at the fire, then at Chains, who desperately needed to get warm, then back at the tiny woman who was staring at him like he was a student who'd forgotten his homework. For the first time in 20 years, Butcher felt like a scolded child. "Boots off, boys," he grumbled, sitting heavily on a delicate entryway bench that groaned under his weight. "Do what the lady says. And watch your language," Mrs. Higgins added, already heading toward what appeared to be a kitchen. "I will not tolerate profanity in this house. If I hear certain words, you will find yourselves back in the snow. Am I understood?" "Yes, ma'am," 16 voices chorused, rough men suddenly sounding like altar boys. Mrs. Higgins paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at them with an expression that was equal parts stern and something else. Something almost soft. "Good. Now, let's get your friend warm and looked at. And someone will need to explain to me why none of you thought to check the weather forecast before attempting a mountain pass in late November." Mrs. Higgins's kitchen was a museum of domesticity. Copper pots hung from ceiling hooks. A vintage stove, somehow still functional, radiated blessed heat. Every surface was spotless. A collection of teacups, each different, each looking expensive and fragile, hung from hooks above the counter. Butcher watched her move through the space with the efficiency of a field commander. She filled a kettle, set it on the stove, pulled down a first aid kit that looked surprisingly comprehensive. "You," she said, pointing at Tiny. "Get your friend onto that sofa. Carefully. If you damage the upholstery, we're going to have words." "You," pointing at Scribbles. "There are blankets in the chest at the top of the stairs. Bring them all down." "You," pointing at Butcher. "Sit at the table and tell me exactly what injuries we're dealing with." They all scrambled to obey. Butcher found himself at a kitchen table covered in a lace tablecloth, watching this elderly woman transform into something between a combat medic and a drill sergeant. Chains twisted his ankle, Butcher reported. Wrenched it pretty good when the bike went down. Nobody else is injured, just cold. Frostbite risk. Maybe fingers and toes. We weren't out that long. Mrs. Higgins nodded, already examining Chains's ankle with surprisingly strong fingers. The biker, a man who'd once taken a bullet in Kandahar without crying, yelped when she probed a tender spot. Not broken, she announced. Severely sprained. You'll need ice, compression, and rest. Also, a lecture on appropriate footwear for winter motorcycling, but we'll save that for later. She wrapped the ankle with practiced efficiency, then turned her attention to the others. One by one, she checked for frostbite, made them remove wet socks, examined fingers that had gone dangerously numb. The kettle whistled. Now then, Mrs. Higgins said, pulling down an alarming number of delicate teacups. We'll have tea. It will warm you from the inside. Butcher watched in fascination as she prepared not coffee, which would have made sense for a group of frozen bikers, but proper English tea. Loose leaf, steeped in a genuine teapot, poured into china cups so delicate they looked like they'd shatter if you breathed on them raw. She served each man with the same ceremony she might have used for the queen. Milk? Sugar? Do try not to grip the handle too tightly. That cup is from my grandmother's collection. Tiny held his teacup like it was a live grenade. The delicate china looked ridiculous in his massive, scarred hands. He took a tiny sip and his eyes widened. This is actually really good. Of course it is, Mrs. Higgins said crisply. I've been making tea for 70 years. I should hope I've learned something. She produced a plate of biscuits, cookies, Butcher corrected himself, and set them on the table. Before anyone could reach for one, her ruler cracked against the table. Grace first, she said firmly. 16 bikers froze. I don't care what your various religious beliefs might be, Mrs. Higgins continued. But in this house, we express gratitude before eating. You may thank whatever deity, philosophy, or cosmic accident you prefer, but you will do so before touching those biscuits. Quietly. In your heads is fine. They bowed their heads. Butcher, who hadn't prayed since his grandmother's funeral, found himself actually grateful for the warmth, the shelter, this strange, fierce woman who'd taken them in without hesitation. After a respectful moment, Mrs. Higgins nodded. You may eat. The bikers descended on the biscuits like starving wolves, but carefully, trying not to scatter crumbs. That's when Butcher noticed the cardboard taped over one of the kitchen windows. Fresh tape. Recent damage. Ma'am, he said carefully, what happened to your window? Mrs. Higgins's expression didn't change, but something hard flickered in her eyes. An unfortunate accident. Nothing to concern yourself with. That tape's fresh. Maybe a day old. You're very observant. Perhaps you should have been a detective rather than a... She gestured vaguely at his leather cut. Whatever it is you are. We're a motorcycle club, Scribbles said helpfully. The Iron Vanguards. We're not a gang or nothing. We just ride together in... Anything, Mrs. Higgins interrupted. Not nothing. The phrase is, we're not a gang or anything. Double negatives are for the intellectually lazy. Scribbles blinked. Yes, ma'am. Butcher tried again. That window didn't break itself. No, Mrs. Higgins agreed, refilling teacups with mechanical precision. It had help. Specifically, a brick with a poorly written thread attached to it. I'm less concerned about the violence than the grammar. The perpetrator used your when he meant your. It was genuinely painful to read. The temperature in the room dropped despite the fire. Someone, Tiny said slowly, threw a brick through your window? With a threat. The third such brick in 2 months. I'm considering starting a collection. Who? Butcher's voice had gone very quiet. Very dangerous. Mrs. Higgins studied him for a long moment. A local young man named Derek Mullins. He's decided that my property would be perfect for expanding his various illegal enterprises. He's attempted to buy the land. When I refused, he resorted to intimidation. Broken windows, cut phone lines, threatening letters. You call the cops? Sheriff Morrison is aware. He's also aware that Derek's uncle is on the county commission. Nothing has been done. Scribbles, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up. That's not right. You're just you're just a lady living alone, and some punk is. I am an old lady, Mrs. Higgins said calmly. There's no shame in accuracy. And yes, it is not right. But it is, unfortunately, the situation. She looked at each of them in turn. Now, the weather report suggests this storm will continue through tomorrow night at minimum. You're welcome to stay here until it passes. I have rules. No drugs, no excessive drinking, no violence in the house, and absolutely no profanity. You will help with chores. You will eat what I prepare. And you will address me as Mrs. Higgins or ma'am. What about weapons? Tiny asked. Keep them on your person if you must, but I'd prefer they remain holstered, sheathed, or otherwise secured. This is a place of refuge, not warfare. Butcher felt something shift in his chest. This woman, this tiny, fierce, proper woman, had just offered shelter to 16 dangerous strangers without hesitation. She'd been threatened, terrorized, abandoned by the law. And yet here she was serving tea in her grandmother's china. "We appreciate the hospitality, ma'am," he said formally. "We'll respect your rules." "I should hope so," Mrs. Higgins replied. "Now, I believe several of you need dry clothes. I have some of my late husband's things in storage." He was a large man. "Not quite as large as you," she nodded at Tiny. "But the garments should suffice." As she bustled off to find clothes, Butcher caught the eyes of his men. They were all thinking the same thing. This woman had saved their lives tonight, and someone was threatening her. That was going to be a problem. For Derek, day one of captivity, because that's what it felt like, even though the prison was warm and smelled like fresh bread, passed in a blur of domestic discipline. Mrs. Higgins woke them at 7 a.m. sharp, not with gentle words, but by walking through the living room, where most of them had slept, ringing an actual brass bell like some kind of Victorian schoolmarm. "Up," she commanded. "Sleeping past sunrise is for the indolent and the dead, and you appear to be neither." Groaning, cursing, quickly stifled when the ruler appeared, the iron vanguards stumbled awake. Breakfast was oatmeal, fresh fruit, and toast. No bacon, no greasy eggs. When Bull complained, Mrs. Higgins fixed him with a stare that could melt steel. "I am 78 years old," she said calmly. "I have maintained this figure through discipline and healthy eating. You will eat what I prepare, or you will eat nothing. Your choice." Bull ate his oatmeal. It was actually delicious, though he'd die before admitting it. After breakfast, Mrs. Higgins produced a list. An actual written list, with tasks assigned to each person. "The storm has damaged several exterior elements of the house," she explained. "Since you're here, you might as well make yourselves useful." Butcher found himself assigned to fixing a loose stair rail. Tiny was sent to clear snow from the roof gutters, from inside the attic, because going outside was suicide. Scribbles got kitchen duty, dishes, sweeping, and something Mrs. Higgins called learning where things belong. The work was oddly calming. Butcher hadn't done honest household repair in years. His hands, used to wrenches and weapons, remembered older skills, measuring twice, cutting once, testing each screw for tightness. Mrs. Higgins supervised like a general inspecting troops. She caught Butcher starting to hammer a nail without checking it was level. "Stop," she commanded. He stopped. "What do we do before we commit to permanence, mister?" She waited expectantly. "Butcher, ma'am. That cannot possibly be your given name." "William. William Cutler. But everyone calls me." "I will call you William," she said firmly. "And William, what do we do before hammering a nail?" "Check that it's level." "Precisely. Measure twice, commit once. It's a principle applicable to carpentry and life decisions." He measured again. It wasn't level. He adjusted. She nodded approval. That afternoon, while Scribbles was helping put away clean dishes, he picked up a book from the counter. Something about classical literature. "Can't read that fancy stuff," he muttered, more to himself than Mrs. Higgins. She turned from the stove where she was preparing dinner. "Can't, or haven't learned yet." Same difference. It absolutely is not the same difference. One is inability, the other is inexperience. Which is it? Scribbles shifted uncomfortably. He was 23, had dropped out of school at 15, barely scraped by reading street signs and text messages. The club didn't care. He was good with bikes, loyal to the bone. But here, with this woman looking at him, he felt ashamed. "Never learned good," he admitted quietly. Mrs. Higgins studied him for a long moment. Then she pulled out a different book, simpler, younger looking. "After dinner, you and I are going to work on that." "I don't need. I didn't ask what you needed. I told you what we're doing. Do you know why they called me the Dragon at Jefferson High School?" "No, ma'am." "Because I breathe fire on mediocrity and excuses. You have a brain. We're going to use it." That evening, while the others watched the one television Mrs. Higgins owned, she allowed 2 hours of educational programming. She sat with Scribbles at the kitchen table and taught him to read. Not like school. Not boring. She used a motorcycle magazine, making him sound out words he actually cared about. Carburetor, suspension, torque. When he got frustrated, she was patient. When he got it right, she was strict with her praise. "Adequate. Try the next one." Butcher watched from the doorway, something old and painful stirring in his chest. His grandmother had tried to teach him like this, before cancer took her. Before the streets took him. Day 2, 9:47 p.m. The brick came through the living room window this time. Butcher was awake. He never slept well in new places, old combat habits. When he heard the crash, he was on his feet with his gun drawn before the glass stopped falling. The other bikers erupted from various sleeping spots, armed and ready for war. Mrs. Higgins emerged from her bedroom in a nightgown and robe, completely calm. She looked at the brick lying on her carpet, looked at 16 heavily armed men ready to kill someone, and sighed. "Put those away," she said, gesturing at the various weapons. "This is Derek being predictable." "Ma'am," Butcher said carefully, not lowering his pistol. "Someone just threw a brick through your window." "Yes, I noticed. It's very inconvenient." She walked to the brick, picked it up with the same two-fingered distaste she'd shown the first time, and unwrapped the note. "Last chance. Sell or burn." My goodness, his spelling has deteriorated. He's misspelled chance as chance. "That's almost impressive." "Mrs. Higgins," Tiny said, his voice shaking with rage. "Who is this guy?" "Exactly." She set the brick down carefully. "Derek Mullins. 30 years old, high school dropout, multiple arrests for drug manufacturing and distribution. His uncle, Robert Mullins, sits on the county commission, which is why Derek has never served significant time. He wants my property because it's isolated, has good road access, and would be perfect for expanding his methamphetamine operation. You know all this and the cops do nothing? Sheriff Morrison has explained that without concrete evidence of who threw the bricks, there's nothing he can do. Derek is careful. He has others do his dirty work." Butcher holstered his weapon. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months of offers. 3 months of threats. 2 months of broken windows. Mrs. Higgins started sweeping up the glass with a dustpan and brush that materialized from somewhere. "I'm retired on a teacher's pension. I cannot afford to keep replacing windows." "Why not sell?" Scribbles asked. "Find somewhere safer." The look Mrs. Higgins gave him could have frozen the sun. "This house," she said quietly, "is where I raised my daughter, where I nursed my husband through his final illness, where I've lived for 47 years. I have taught over 3,000 students. I have fought incompetent administrators, budget-slashing politicians, and the slow degradation of educational standards. I did not survive all of that to be intimidated by a meth-cooking dropout who can't spell chance." She turned her back on them, taping fresh cardboard over the new hole. "I will not run. This is my home." The bikers looked at each other. Butcher saw his own thoughts reflected in their eyes. This woman had taken them in, fed them, treated them with more maternal discipline and care than most of them had experienced in decades. And some punk was terrorizing her. "Ma'am," Butcher said carefully, "when the storm clears, we gotta head back to the clubhouse. Got business to handle. But maybe we could have a conversation with Derek before we go. Man to man." "Absolutely not," Mrs. Higgins said firmly. "I will not have you engaging in violence on my behalf. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am." But the way he said it made her narrow her eyes. "William, I mean it. No violence." "Heard you loud and clear, ma'am. No violence. We wouldn't dream of it." Later, after Mrs. Higgins had gone to bed, Butcher gathered his men in the kitchen. "We're not touching this Derek while we're here," he said quietly. "Gave the lady our word, but we're going to need to do some research. Find out where this punk operates, who his crew is, what he drives." "Boss," Tiny rumbled. "We're just going to talk to him, right?" Butcher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh yeah, just a friendly conversation. Very educational. About respect, property rights, and what happens when you threaten little old ladies who make good tea." The men grinned. These were men who'd fought in foreign wars, survived prison riots, and buried too many brothers. They knew exactly what kind of conversation Butcher meant. "Scribbles," Butcher said, "you're good with computers when we got internet. Soon as we're back at the clubhouse, I want everything on Derek Mullins. Addresses, known associates, criminal history, where he gets his morning coffee. Everything. On it, boss." They dispersed back to their sleeping spots, but sleep was hard. They'd all seen the fear Mrs. Higgins tried to hide when she picked up that brick. The tiny tremor in her hands. The way she'd checked every door lock twice before going to bed. This tiny, fierce woman was terrified, and she was too proud to ask for help. Fortunately, she didn't have to ask. Day 3. The snow stopped. Butcher stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The storm had dumped nearly 6 feet of snow, but the sky was clear now, achingly blue. Behind him, Mrs. Higgins emerged with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, black, no sugar, exactly how he'd mentioned liking it 2 days ago. "Roads will be clear by noon," she said. The county plow comes through here first because of the old logging route. Yeah. They stood in silence, sipping coffee. Butcher realized he didn't want to leave. This house, with its rules and routines and unexpected warmth, felt more like home than the clubhouse had in years. William, Mrs. Higgins said quietly, I know what you're planning. Ma'am, I don't. Don't insult my intelligence. I've been teaching for over 40 years. I know what young men look like when they're planning violence. I see it in your eyes, in theirs. Butcher said nothing. Derek is a bad man, she continued. But he has connections. His uncle controls local law enforcement. If you hurt him, it will come back on you. On your club. Maybe. Not maybe. Certainly. She turned to face him, and her eyes were fierce. You've given me 3 days of unexpected companionship. You've fixed my stairs, cleared my gutters, and young Scribbles made remarkable progress with his reading. I don't want to repay that by seeing you in prison. We can handle ourselves. I'm sure you can. But handle yourselves where? In a cell? On the run? Is that worth it for an old woman's pride? Butcher looked down at her. This tiny, fierce, impossible woman who'd civilized 16 outlaws with nothing but tea and a ruler. Ma'am, with respect, you don't understand. Then explain it to me. My grandma raised me, Butcher said quietly. Tiny's mom was a junkie, barely knew her. Scribbles grew up in foster care. Most of us, we got no family that matters. The club's all we got. He gestured at the house. You took us in, fed us, treated us like people worth teaching. Not animals, not criminals, people. His voice roughened. Derek's gonna keep coming. Gonna keep throwing bricks, cutting lines, making threats. Eventually, he's gonna escalate. Gonna do more than throw bricks. Mrs. Higgins was very quiet. We can't stay here and protect you, Butcher continued. Got business back home, but we also can't just leave you to this punk. So yeah, we're gonna have a conversation with Derek. Explain some things about respect and consequences. And if I forbid it, then we'll do it anyway, and feel bad about disobeying. But we'll still do it. Mrs. Higgins turned away, looking at the snow-covered mountains. When she spoke again, her voice was very soft. In 43 years of teaching, I learned that some students respond to gentle correction. Others require a firmer hand. And a very few respond only to consequences they can't ignore. She didn't turn around. Derek Mullins, she said carefully, often has breakfast at a diner called May's Kitchen. Every morning at 8 a.m. He drives a lifted red pickup truck. He typically has 2 associates with him, Carlos and Pete, both with criminal records for assault. Butcher smiled. Mrs. Higgins continued, still not looking at him. I am not endorsing violence. I am simply providing information that someone observed. What you do with that information is your own decision. Are we clear on that distinction? Crystal clear, ma'am. By noon, the bikes were dug out and running. Chains could ride, barely, with his ankle wrapped. The men packed their gear, cleaned the house to Mrs. Higgins's exacting standards, and gathered on the porch. Butcher tried to give her money. She refused. You fixed my stairs and gutters. We'll call it even. Ma'am, you saved our lives. You would have survived. You're too stubborn to freeze. But her eyes were soft. Scribbles stepped forward, awkward and formal. Mrs. Higgins, I wrote you something. Like you asked. He handed her a piece of paper, his first ever thank you note, written in careful, locky handwriting. It took Mrs. Higgins 3 tries to read it because her eyes kept misting up. Dear Mrs. Higgins, thank you for teaching me reading better. Thank you for the food and the warm house. You are a good teacher. I will practice more. Sincerely, James Scribbles Rodriguez. She folded it carefully and put it in her cardigan pocket. B- for content, but I'm deducting points for reading better instead of improving my reading skills. We'll work on that next time. Next time? Of course next time. You're not done with lessons. You'll write me a letter every month. I'll correct it and send it back. Are we clear? Scribbles' face split into a grin. Yes, ma'am. The engines roared to life, 16 bikes rumbling like distant thunder. Mrs. Higgins stood on her porch, tiny and proper in her cardigan, waving as the iron vanguards rolled out. Butcher looked back once. She was already going inside, probably to make tea and grade his goodbye note. He'd gotten a B+, which felt like a victory. What she didn't see was the way he marked her address and his GPS flagged it. Made sure every man in the club had it saved. They were leaving, but they'd be back. Derek Mullins just didn't know it yet. 1 week later, Derek Mullins sat in his pickup truck outside May's Kitchen, smoking a cigarette and feeling good about life. The old lady still hadn't sold. That was fine. He was patient. Another week or two of escalating pressure, and she'd crack. They all did eventually. "Boss, we doing the diner thing today?" Carlos asked from the passenger seat. Carlos was 19, dumb as a box of rocks, but loyal and willing to hurt people for $50 and a burger. Nah, change of plans. Today we send the final message. What message? Derek pulled out a gas can from the truck bed. Gonna take a ride up to the old lady's place. Gonna burn that Victorian dump to the ground. She can't refuse to sell if there's nothing left to sell. Pete, in the back seat, hesitated. "Man, that's arson. That's serious time if we get caught." "We won't get caught. Place is isolated. No witnesses. Those biker freaks that were staying with her are long gone. I had my cousin watching, saw them leave days ago. Old lady's alone again." Derek smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Time to teach her the final lesson. Mrs. Higgins was in her kitchen, preparing lunch, when Mr. Darcy started hissing at the window. She looked up and saw the red pickup truck coming up her long driveway. 3 men inside. Derek was driving. Her hands started to shake. She set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables and picked up the phone. Still dead. She'd thought about getting a cell phone, but they were expensive on a teacher's pension. She was alone. The truck parked. 3 men got out. Derek was holding a gas can. Mrs. Higgins picked up Mr. Darcy and went to her bedroom. She locked the door, a pathetic gesture, but it made her feel slightly better. Then she sat on her bed, holding her cat, and did something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. Downstairs, she heard the front door splinter. Derek's voice, loud and crude, echoed through her house. Come out, old lady. Time to have a conversation about property values." Footsteps on her stairs. The doorknob rattled. "I know you're in there," Derek called. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just sign the deed over, and nobody gets hurt." Well, mostly nobody. His friends laughed. Mrs. Higgins clutched Mr. Darcy tighter. She was 78 years old. She'd faced down teenage bullies, incompetent administrators, and her own husband's death with dignity and strength. But she was terrified. Derek kicked the bedroom door. It held, but barely. Last chance teach. He kicked again. The door jamb cracked. And that's when Mrs. Higgins heard it. A rumble, distant at first, then growing. Getting louder. The entire house started to vibrate, china rattling in cabinets. Derek paused. What thing? The rumble became a roar. Not one engine. Not two. Dozens. Derek ran to the bedroom window and looked out. His face went pale. Coming up the driveway, filling the entire road, was an army of motorcycles. Not 16 bikes. 40. 50. More. The entire Iron Vanguard's MC, every chapter within 200 miles, rolling in formation like an invading force. At the front, riding side by side, were Butcher and Tiny. They weren't hurrying. They weren't rushing. They were coming with the inevitability of a landslide. Derek stumbled backward. No. Derek. Carlos's voice from downstairs, shaking. Derek, we got a problem. Derek ran. Down the stairs, past the destroyed door, onto the porch where he froze. 50 bikers stood in a semicircle around his truck. They weren't moving, weren't threatening, just standing there, engines idling, staring at him. Butcher shut off his bike and dismounted. He walked forward, boots crunching in the gravel, until he was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. Derek Mullins, he said conversationally. We've been looking for you. Derek tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Tiny stepped in front of him. Derek bounced off the giant like a tennis ball hitting a wall. Where you going? Tiny asked pleasantly. Class just started. I don't know who you think you are, Derek stammered. But my uncle is on the county commission, and if you touch me. Your uncle Robert, Butcher interrupted. Yeah, we know. Talked to him this morning, actually. Nice conversation. Explained we were concerned citizens investigating property harassment. He was very helpful. That was a lie. They hadn't talked to Robert Mullins. But Derek didn't know that. You broke into this woman's home. Butcher continued, walking up the porch steps. With a gas can. With clear intent to commit arson. That's serious time, Derek. 20 years maybe. Federal time. You can't prove anything. Don't need to prove it. You're standing here with a gas can, a broken door, and 50 witnesses who just watched you threaten an elderly woman. Derek looked around wildly. His friends Carlos and Pete were already on their knees, hands behind their heads, surrounded by bikers who looked like they ate nails for breakfast. Mrs. Higgins, Butcher called, not taking his eyes off Derek. You can come out now, ma'am. You're safe. The bedroom door opened slowly. Mrs. Higgins emerged, still holding Mr. Darcy, and came to the top of the stairs. She looked at Derek, at the bikers, at her splintered front door. "William," she said quietly, "I thought we discussed the no violence rule." "We're not in your house, ma'am," Butcher said respectfully. "We're on the porch. Technically outside. That's semantics." "Yes, ma'am, but accurate semantics." Despite everything, Mrs. Higgins almost smiled. Butcher turned back to Derek. "Here's how this is gonna go. You're gonna fix this door. Then you're gonna fix every window you've broken. Then you're gonna apologize to Mrs. Higgins. In writing, with proper grammar. And if I don't, then we're gonna have a very different kind of educational experience. One that involves learning what parts of the body break most easily." Tiny cracked his knuckles. It sounded like gunshots. Derek looked at the 50 bikers surrounding him, at the giant blocking his exit, at Butcher's cold, dead eyes that promised unspeakable violence. "I'll fix the door," he whispered. "Good choice." It took 3 hours. Derek, Carlos, and Pete, under the watchful eyes of the Iron Vanguards, repaired the door, replaced all the broken windows, and cleaned up every bit of damage they'd caused. Mrs. Higgins supervised, ruler in hand, correcting their technique. "You're holding the screwdriver wrong," she told Carlos. "Like this. Firm grip, steady pressure. Were you raised by wolves?" When they finished, Butcher handed Derek a pen and paper. "Now the apology." Derek wrote, his hand shaking. "Dear Mrs. Higgins, I'm sorry for breaking your windows and scaring you. I won't come back. I'm sorry. Derek Mullins." Mrs. Higgins read it, her expression severe. "This is barely adequate. Your penmanship is atrocious. I'm sorry appears twice, redundant and lazy. And you failed to address the emotional trauma you've caused." She handed it back. "Rewrite it. And this time, think about what you're actually apologizing for." It took Derek 4 tries before Mrs. Higgins accepted the apology letter. "Better," she said finally. "Still a C-, but better." Butcher walked Derek to his truck, his hand heavy on the smaller man's shoulder. "Now, Derek, here's the thing. Mrs. Higgins is under our protection now. You come near this property, you even think about her, and what happens next won't be a conversation. It'll be an anatomy lesson. We clear." "Clear," Derek gasped. "Your meth lab up on Collins Road, the one you think nobody knows about. It'd be a shame if it caught fire. Spontaneously, while you were in it." Derek's eyes went wide. "How did you?" "We know everything, Derek. Where you sleep, where you eat, who you work with. We know your uncle's address, his grandkids' school, your mama's dialysis schedule." Butcher leaned in close. "We're not going to hurt any of them. But I want you to understand. You threaten our people, we threaten yours. You hurt our teacher, we hurt you. Badly. In ways that won't show up on an x-ray. She's not even. You just met her. Doesn't matter. She's ours now. Under our protection. Anyone touches her, they answer to us." Butcher stepped back. "Now get in your truck and drive. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't send friends. You're done here." Derek scrambled into his truck. Carlos and Pete were already inside, crying quietly. The red pickup peeled out, throwing gravel, and disappeared down the mountain road. Butcher watched it go, then turned to find Mrs. Higgins standing on the porch, arms crossed. "William," she said sternly, "that was violent." "No, ma'am. That was educational. You threatened him." "Yes, ma'am. Sometimes threats are part of the curriculum." Mrs. Higgins studied him for a long moment. Then she did something Butcher hadn't expected. She smiled. Really smiled, not the tight, controlled expression she usually wore. "Would you and your friends like to stay for dinner? I'm making pot roast." The Iron Vanguards didn't leave that night. Or the next day. Or the day after that. "Security detail," Butcher explained when Mrs. Higgins questioned why 40 bikers were still camped on her property. "Just making sure Derek got the message. And you need 40 men for that. Safety in numbers, ma'am." What actually happened was that word had spread through the club. The old lady who'd saved their president. The teacher who'd corrected grammar and demanded respect. Stories grew with each retelling. She'd faced down Butcher with a ruler. She'd fed them tea in china cups. She'd made scribbles learn to read. Within the club culture, rough men who valued loyalty, strength, and chosen family. Mrs. Higgins had become something sacred. A matriarch. The mother/grandmother most of them never had. They wanted to protect her. But more than that, they wanted to be near her. Mrs. Higgins, for her part, adapted to having an army of bikers in her front yard with the same aplomb she'd shown everything else. She established rules. No loud music after 9 p.m. All trash goes in designated bins. Anyone caught urinating on her property would be banned permanently. Daily vocabulary lessons would be held at 3 p.m. for anyone interested. Surprisingly, attendance at the vocabulary lessons was nearly perfect. She taught them words like ephemeral, ubiquitous, and juxtaposition. Grown men who'd never finished high school sat in her living room, taking notes, trying to use ubiquitous in sentences. Motorcycles are ubiquitous in the club, Tiny offered. Close, Mrs. Higgins said. But motorcycles are specific to your club, not everywhere. Try again. Traffic lights are ubiquitous. Better. Yes. Found everywhere in modern society. Good. Tiny beamed like he'd won a medal. 2 weeks after the Derrick incident, Mrs. Higgins received a visitor. Sheriff Morrison pulled up in his cruiser, looking nervous. He'd heard about the biker army occupying the Higgins property and had finally worked up the courage to investigate. Butcher met him at the property line, arms crossed. "Sheriff," he said neutrally, "I'm here to check on Mrs. Higgins. Make sure she's all right." "She's fine. Better than fine. I'd like to hear that from her." Mrs. Higgins appeared on the porch, looking amused. "Sheriff Morrison, how thoughtful of you to check on me. Weeks after I reported multiple instances of criminal harassment that you did nothing about." Morrison flinched. "Ma'am," I explained. "You explained that without evidence, you couldn't act. Yet I'm quite certain that if I gathered statements from the 50 witnesses who saw Derrick Mullins attempting to commit arson, you'd suddenly find sufficient evidence. Wouldn't you?" The sheriff said nothing. "I thought so." Mrs. Higgins's voice was ice. "Derrick Mullins is no longer a problem. His methamphetamine laboratory on Collins Road has been mysteriously destroyed. I believe the DA might be interested in investigating, though I'm sure you'll handle it with your usual efficiency." Morrison looked at Butcher, who smiled innocently. "I know what you did," the sheriff said quietly. "Do you? And what exactly did we do, Sheriff?" "Stayed on private property as invited guests of the owner, fixed some doors, had some educational conversations, all completely legal. If I find out—" "You won't find out anything," Mrs. Higgins interrupted, "because there's nothing to find. Unless you'd like me to start asking questions about why the nephew of a county commissioner has been allowed to terrorize elderly citizens without consequence. I'm sure the newspaper would find that story fascinating." Morrison got back in his cruiser without another word. After he left, Mrs. Higgins turned to Butcher. "That was dangerous. You've made an enemy of local law enforcement. Worth it. He could cause problems for your club. Let him try." Butcher's smile was sharp. "We've dealt with worse than small-town sheriffs." 3 months later, Mrs. Evelyn Higgins sat on her porch, grading papers. Not from her teaching days. Those were long past. These were letters from her students in the Iron Vanguards. Scribbles wrote every week now. His handwriting had improved dramatically. He was reading at a 6th grade level and climbing. Tiny sent book reports. Actual book reports on novels Mrs. Higgins assigned. His latest was on Of Mice and Men, and he'd made some surprisingly insightful observations about Lenny and George's relationship. Even Butcher wrote occasionally. Short letters, stilted and formal, but improving. He'd started taking online classes, getting his GED first, then maybe college courses. "Can't be a leader if I'm ignorant," he'd written. "You taught me that." The house had changed. New windows, professionally installed. A security system, discreet but thorough. The driveway was paved now, making it easier for visitors. And there were visitors. Constant visitors. Bikers who stopped by to check on her, fix things, bring groceries. Brothers who called her Ma, and meant it. Men who'd lived violent lives finding unexpected peace in a Victorian cottage with a tiny teacher who demanded proper grammar. A sign now hung on her gate. Hand-carved wood, beautifully made. Higgins Residence. Protected by the Iron Vanguard's MC. Trespassers will be educated. Mr. Darcy, now 14 and grumpy, had gained several pounds from all the bikers who snuck him treats despite being told not to. Mrs. Higgins heard motorcycles approaching. She looked up to see Butcher and 5 others rolling in, bikes gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Afternoon, ma'am," Butcher called, dismounting. "Brought you something." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a check, a large check, from the club treasury. "What's this for?" "Your roof needs work. Notice some shingles are loose. This should cover a full replacement, professional job." "William, I can't accept. It's not charity. It's paying our teacher. You've been tutoring 15 of us for 3 months. That's worth something." Mrs. Higgins looked at the check, then at the men standing in her driveway. Rough, dangerous men who called her Ma and brought her groceries and wrote book reports because she asked them to. "Very well," she said, "but I'm investing this money in educational materials. If I'm running a school, I need proper supplies. Yes, ma'am. That evening, sitting around her dining room table, extended to accommodate 8 people, Mrs. Higgins served pot roast to her students. Scribbles, she said, tell me about the book you finished. The outsiders, Scribbles said, proud. About these kids, the greasers and the socks. They fight a lot, but they're all just trying to find family, you know? And what did you learn from it? That family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's who stands with you when things get bad. Mrs. Higgins smiled. A+, James. That's exactly right. Later, after the men left, Mrs. Higgins sat in her chair by the fire, Mr. Darcy purring in her lap. She thought about the brick that had started this, the terrifying night when 16 frozen strangers had burst through her door. She'd gained sons that night. Dangerous, violent, surprisingly educable sons, but sons nonetheless. Her house was no longer quiet. Her days were no longer lonely. And her Persian rug had survived yet another crisis. Outside, the sound of motorcycle engines faded into the mountain darkness, but she knew they'd be back. They always came back, because class was never really over. And every student, no matter how rough or scarred, deserved a teacher who believed they could be better. Mrs. Evelyn Higgins, retired English teacher, graded one final letter before bed. It was from Butcher, announcing he'd passed his GED exam. She wrote at the top, in red ink, A+. I'm proud of you, William. Then she went to sleep, safe in her Victorian cottage, protected by an army of students who'd learned that respect, loyalty, and proper grammar were worth fighting for.